Good morning. How are you, sir?
Good to see you guys.
Good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah. Well, I saw some of you a little while ago, didn't I?
Yeah, that was as your tour was forcefully winding down right before your eyes.
It sure was. It sure was.
Well, it was a great show.
Mm.
Yeah, we really enjoyed that.
I have to be honest, it got better because it was early on, but it still was a good show.
Oh, it was.
Yeah.
Had a few different players than the year before, but it was all good.
Yeah.
What
Love
was,
Great seats.
what
Love
was
that drummer,
played that?
Alan Childs.
Yeah. What was the tune you played that had the piano solo that helped launch your career?
I think it's Aladdin Sane it's called.
Yes. Yeah.
That was fun to play.
Very much remember that tune, and we're totally blown away when they first heard you play like that.
It turned out it's 47 years since the release of that album.
Wow.
Just the other day.
Yeah.
Just the other day.
We had a similar experience because we just celebrated the band's 50th anniversary of this incarnation of the Gringos.
50.
50.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
And we're all still around, Mike.
Yeah.
So you guys are making music?
Making music again.
That's
Right.
good. So you're doing it online, sending parts and stuff like that?
Trying to figure it out
Yeah.
with all these little gremlins, you know.
Well, we grew up in a different era, didn't we?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're kind of gathered we're trying to put together a podcast for the band that we're going to be putting out in increments. And we did our first episode with Joe LaBarbera the other day. Clyde and I did a really great interview with Joe. And we wanted to get you in because there's a side of the Mike Garson world that a lot of people don't know about, and that's your jazz and your classical world. People all know about your influence with and your touring with David Bowie and all the stuff you did with him for years. But it's the jazz stuff that's not that well, represented that we want to know about because you played with some really, really top-notch cats and studied with all the best.
I used to be very frustrated about that phenomenon, but I had to just let it go and it'll do what it does. People have a hard time with the concept of multitasking or somebody can do several things. So the majority of the people out there just be very happy that I do the Bowie thing. So I'll just let it be. But that doesn't mean I don't stop creating the other music. I just don't fight it uphill.
As far as your classical background, you studied a lot of classical piano when you were young then, before you started getting involved in jazz?
Yes, the first 7 years was only classical. Then I got to hear Dave Brubeck and Errol Garner, and I kind of got the bug, and I thought, I think I could do this thing. I like the fact that you could make up your own notes and start to improvise. So I kept up the classical while I was starting to learn the jazz, but I was trying to find jazz teachers in New York at the time. It was 1960. And by and large, anyone who I would speak to said, you can't study this. You either have to feel it or you can't do it. If you don't have that feel and you didn't grow up with that music and you weren't growing up in St. Louis or somewhere in the Black communities where the music evolved from, how do you learn that? So I just kept asking questions, and I was fortunate enough to get a recommendation on. It was through my dad. He took me to a jazz club called the Half Note, and I got introduced to Lenny Tristano, who was a blind pianist, and he used to play with Warren Marsh and Lee Konitz. He even played with Charlie Parker, and he was willing to accept me as a student. I actually auditioned for him at the club on the intermission in the Half Note, I played Take 5. It was very limited. I just sort of played it out of a fake book style. But he could tell I could play, and he took me on as a student. And then I found another teacher named Hal Overton, who did Thelonious Monk arrangements for the Town Hall album. I think it came out in '63. It was sort of a big band. So he was a guy who taught at Juilliard, but also loved jazz and Bud Powell. And he gave me Monk chord changes with melodies that he had notated and Monk gave to him back in the day. So I was learning those songs. And then I would get to play with Monk's rhythm section at the New School in Manhattan. And little by little, I moved around. Herbie Hancock came up to visit the band I was playing with upstate New York in the Catskills with Dave Liebman, who's a great sax player. And he came to, Herbie came to visit us because he was friends with the drummer who was called Bob Moses. He's still around. And he sat in, I mean, I was 16 and Herbie sat in and played the standard Don't Blame Me. It was pretty spectacular. And then I asked him if he'd give me some lessons. So I went to him and he gave me 3 lessons. And then a year later, I went to see Bill Evans in the Village Vanguard. I asked him for a lesson. He gave me a 6-hour free lesson. So wow. I was always inquiring. And then there were people who were not famous, but they actually were even better teachers than the people I just mentioned, who knew how to break it down better. So a guy named Larry Schubert and a guy named Art Murphy, and they filled in information. So I realized there was a lot of data and missing information I had on, let's say, call it a code. You had to break the code. It was a jazz code, and it wasn't just as simple as just the blues scale. And I practiced and practiced and practiced 8 hours a day, and it didn't sound great to me for a long time because it wasn't my natural inclination, which was more classical. But one fine day, it sort of woke up and kind of found my way of doing it. And it's still evolving. You know, you're an eternal music student. The only time I'm teaching is when I teach, and the only time I perform is when I'm on stage. Most of the other time, I'm learning. You know.
Right. Did you ever run into a guy named Rand Blake up around Boston? He taught at the New England Conservatory.
I heard of him, but I never ran into him.
Yeah, I was fortunate to have a couple of lessons with him while we were on the road, but we tried to pick up stuff here and there. We got to go to the Hall's Mall and the Jazz Workshop in Boston a lot and see a lot of the greats like Herbie Hancock and, you know,
Roy Tyner
and
Airto Moriarty.
You know, a lot of the greats.
I always wish I went to that club, but I just, you know, being in New York, I didn't go there, but I always knew about it, you know. Yeah.
When you played with Monk's band, was Frankie Dunlop playing drums?
Was who?
Frankie Dunlop. You mentioned playing with Monk's band in New York in a school or something.
Yeah, it was called the New School. I think it was Frankie Dunlop. Yeah. He had a nice feel.
How much now when you compose, how much of the classical background affects your composition when you're composing jazz things?
It's always there. It's always there. At a certain point, maybe 20, 30 years ago, how do I put it? The boundaries of jazz and classical and fusion and pop sort of dissolved for me. So it's whatever I hear or feel in the moment. So
is that where your now music came from? Once that all kind of culminated in your, you know, your abilities and everything, you started doing your now music?
Well, what had happened is I had done so much jazz improvisation, and somewhere around 1992, and I was in LA, there were very few people I could feel I could even play with. And I sort of hit the highest level I had at the time as a jazz player, and in some ways was disappointed I didn't have people to play with, because LA is not like New York. And there was Joe LaBarbera around, who was amazing to work with, but there were few and far between. And then somehow I took the concept of improvisation that I learned all those years in jazz, and I decided to create a self-imposed discipline and see if I could improvise in a classical style without using any jazz licks or vocabulary. And then I also, for the first few years, self-imposed the idea of playing only atonal. So I did that for quite some time, wrote hundreds of pieces that way. And then at a certain point, I removed that restriction, and I didn't mind if I wrote tonally, atonally, if it had jazz elements, pop, classical, rock. But for at least 6 or 7 years, everything was atonal classical. But that really is a more limited audience even than jazz. And at a certain point, I got it out of my system, and now it's, again, whatever I hear in my inner ear or feel in the moment. And that's what comes out these days. It's very dependent on who's in the audience and who my audience is, because my fingers tend to be affected by the people I'm around. So when I was playing with Freddie Hubbard, I remember my jazz playing was much better. And when I'm playing the Bowie thing, my jazz doesn't come out. It's more the avant-garde stuff and some of the classical stuff and some of the rock stuff with some jazz voicings, but the actual linear vocabulary of the bebop and the post-bebop, all that stuff hardly comes out when I do the Bowie stuff, because that audience wants to hear something else. Right. So there's a telepathic connection to who I'm playing for. So consequently, when I'm writing myself in the middle of the night, the stuff I could tolerate a much higher degree of dissonance and crazy stuff. But when I have people in the room, it's different, because nobody ever mentioned that's a possibility. And I was playing a gig in San Francisco that I thought was a jazz gig, and my fingers were playing more new age music, and I was very confused. So on the intermission, I said to Buddha, I'm sorry, I don't seem to be playing jazz too well. I seem to be playing more new age. And he laughed. He said, well, you did an album for our label that was new age, and that's who this audience is. That's when I realized there's much more to music than just the chords and the melody and the rhythm, you know?
There's a subconscious connection, wasn't there?
Say again?
There's a subconscious connection to where you were.
Yeah, I mean, I think every artist, when they're on stage, you know, certainly when you're reading written parts, you're stuck to the parts. But when there's moments for improv, you know, it's affected by everyone around you. Even the written parts are affected by everyone around you. When I used to see classical pianists playing the same piece, they'd interpret it different each time, different dynamics, this and that. So I think the more you love the music and the more you've done your homework, the more you will be connected to the audience.
Yeah. How did Bowie's band put music together? Was it pretty much like he felt it, or because he had such great players with him, did he let you guys contribute to the arrangement of the song?
He very much allowed us to contribute. It was an interesting transition for me, because when I came into the band, I was used to reading chords and charts and all this stuff. And they didn't do it that way. They just sort of sat around and here's this chord, here's that chord, put it together, more like rock musicians. The lead guitarist, Mike Garson, had a good feeling for orchestration. He played some piano, so he could write out the changes of certain songs for me. But it was very collaborative. David never considered himself a great musician, although he was in a different way than like a trained musician, but he certainly had a great flair for songwriting, for lyrics, for chord changes, for different different approaches. And but he still utilized whoever was in his band, and I played in 13 different bands. Whoever was in his band always was the right person. He always knew who to have in the different periods that he worked with. In the first 2 years, I played with 5 different bands with him. So I saw how fast he was changing from English musicians to American musicians and things of that nature. So he very much he had a vision of what he wanted for his music and his albums, which changed through the years. Each album had different vision, but he'd give you a very broad vision and he'd give you a lot of space to create. So he didn't micromanage, but he was very much into the collaborative effort.
Cool.
By the way,
Yeah.
not a trained musician, sometimes our training and stuff allows us to function in different styles of music, but it can inhibit us too by standardization. You know, here's another 8-bar section, here's another 8-bar section. And as functional musicians, we tend to be sometimes trapped by those conventions that maybe he wasn't trapped by being untrained, you know?
There's advantages both ways, you know. I know that I started fooling around and teaching very gently. One of my grandsons on drums at 2, and he was very free, and there was a lot of natural Elvin Jones coming out of him, just like very, very free. And then as he got older, when the teachers started showing him form and rhythms, he actually lost that ability and became interested in reading and playing with a metronome and learning beats. And it got a little stiff. And now he's 14. He's somewhere trying to get back to that other place, in combination with still becoming a good musician and reading and all that. So I think it goes in stages in somebody's life where there's a lot of discipline for certain periods, and then you look for a lot of freedom in other periods. It's a balance.
Yeah. Well, this has been great for you to spend time with us. We really appreciate it. I mean, if there's, I don't want to keep you from your call there. Do you have any more time, or you got to go?
We could do another one. I have to go only because and I'm trying to figure out how you make a living when you can't leave your house, and this is the perfect thing.
You got that. The whole world's trying to figure that out.
I happened to just be glancing on YouTube, and I saw this app, and I was bored and sitting at the piano, and I'm playing along with these arrangements, and they were fun. There was like Bruce Hornsby, and there was Billy Joel, and there was Louis Armstrong, and there was different degrees of levels. So I enjoyed it, and then I realized I probably could contribute to this, and the guy was aware of who I was, and so now I'm working on could keep me off the streets, which I have to be anyway. So I'll be doing that for quite some time now.
Yeah. Geez, Mike, we've got about 1 million questions. I'd love to hear everything about what you've done and how you've done it.
Well, let's do a part. If you're doing a podcast, these things go on. We can do another one in a couple of weeks.
Perfect. We'll do.
That's great.
Sounds great.
We'll schedule another one.
This was a good start because, you know, I'm talking to fellow musicians, so I could say it like it is, as opposed to, you know, there's another agenda. There's no agenda other than sharing music, you know.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Terrific.
Well, thank you for your time.
My
Mike,
pleasure. We'll do it again.
absolutely. We'll be in touch soon.